You are listening to American Ambassadors Live, the podcast on international affairs sponsored by the Council of American Ambassadors in Washington, D.C. The Council is the association of non-career U.S. ambassadors who have represented America under presidents from John F. Kennedy through Donald Trump.
Our guest today is Ambassador Jim Gilmore, who was United States Ambassador to the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe from 2019 till January 2021. He has a long career in public service, including serving as governor of Virginia, and came back recently from a mission to Ukraine with the American Foreign Policy Council, whose advisory board he has just joined. Ambassador Gilmore, welcome.
Good, Jim. Thank you very much, Mr. Ambassador. Appreciate the chance to be with you.
Well, let's start off with the OSCE. It is not as well known as, shall we say, most countries in the world, but it's very important to the security of the United States and the security of the free world. So tell us a little bit about what the organization is and the role of the U.S. ambassador in it.
Well, it's the largest national security organization in the world. It's a multinational organization with 57 countries, covers a very broad geographical range. The mission of that organization is to basically try to sustain Western values and democratic values, human rights, but also national security issues, trying to keep the peace. And I mean, I'll tell your listeners right now, in my view, Europe is not a very stable place and it's not a very safe place. And I could talk about that a little bit more, but these 57 countries are basically everybody in the Northern Hemisphere. It comes across everybody in Europe, everybody in the Baltics, everybody in the Scandinavian countries, all the way down through Eastern Europe, out into Central Asia, Turkey, all the North Caucasus countries, Ukraine. So it's a very, very busy place and a lot of opportunity for diplomacy for the United States in this organization.
We have international organizations like the United Nations, which both are places for people to talk about issues, but they also have operating agencies, various places. You have the European Union, which has lots of operations. You have NATO, which has military operations. What exactly does the OSCE do?
The OSCE is focused on basically the diplomacy. You know, when I got to this organization, I'm very proud, by the way, to have been appointed as ambassador to this organization by President Trump and to be confirmed unanimously by the United States Senate. So I'm very proud of all that. But when I got there, I thought, what does this organization do? And then I learned from the meetings once a week at the Hofburg, where all the ambassadors, all 57 countries met together at the same time, that there is value in the United States expressing its position. And people watch those statements. They try to determine whether we're serious about them. They watch the nuances of change, whether or not we're sticking to our guns, whether we're changing. So the primary purpose is diplomacy. But to be more specific, its focus is on international security. One of its principal focuses is Ukraine, which of course part of it was taken by Russia in violation of all international law, the Crimea. There was a great deal of focus on that illegality and that aggressiveness by the Russians. The organization has full participation by the Russians and everybody else. So I'm fond of saying that if you really want to have real negotiations in international relations, you ought to look at OSCE. You can look to NATO, but it's a military alliance just to the Western allies. It doesn't really interact with adversaries at all. You can look to the European Union, but that's basically a sort of a semi-country, mostly economic, and it doesn't deal with the Russians. OSCE has full membership and participation of the Russians, which means there's an opportunity to interact diplomatically every day. I also met with a number of the other diplomats all the time, including what we call the Quad, which is a European Quad of the Americans, the British, the French, and the Germans. We met every week. So it's an opportunity to express America's position. It deals with a lot of different issues. For example, it was a full-fledged war while I was there between Azerbaijan and Armenia, which we had the intervention of the Turks on one hand and the Russians on the other. There's just a lot going on over there, Jim, and this is a real opportunity for real diplomacy in my view.
You mentioned the Quad, which is sort of a caucus in the sense of a group of countries in the organization who work together, meet regularly, as you said. Is there an equivalent one aligned with Russia and other countries in the OSCE?
Not actually. They have tried to structure together some friendly countries to work with them, but those countries are pretty determined to be independent, the same way that our allies are. But I don't think that they really try to call the shots on their people, and we really don't. We have to actually cooperate with our allies and work with our allies and be respectful of our allies. But I do want to say one thing. There was a lot of talk in the United States in the last administration about how President Trump had just made all the allies just hate him. There was just a lot of talk about that.
I've heard that.
Yeah, we've all heard that. And but I want to report to your viewers that in my experience, it was not true. The French, the Germans, the British, and ourselves, we all understood what we were trying to do and how we were all on the same team. We were very warm, very friendly. Those relationships I still have to this day. And that doesn't even count the middle countries like Poland, Romania, Hungary, those countries that are trying to find their new way. And they're depending upon the allies and specifically the United States to stand up for them in a time of real crisis in Europe.
To what extent are debates and discussions in the OSCE public as opposed to private?
They are private. I wish they were not private. I think they should be public. As a matter of fact, the U.S. then proceeded to take at least our statements and to translate them out into Russian and to other countries and to get them out on the internet on the webpage. I also should mention that a major function of OSCE, which is a monitoring unit that exists in eastern Ukraine, in the Donetsk, Luhansk area. The OSCE has hundreds and hundreds of monitors there to watch what's going on, to be an early tripwire and warning so that if there's a continuing war there, that we will try to stop it or have an early warning about it and try to not let it happen.
Are those monitors from OSCE, are they in, I'm sure Ukraine says the land is Ukraine's and Russia says the land is Russia's, but from a military point of view, which side of the line are they on? Are they inside the area that both countries claim?
Yeah, no, they're in, well, they operate in both sides, eastern and western Ukraine, but their primary function is to work inside eastern Ukraine. And particularly look at that border between Russia and eastern Ukraine. And I must say, the United States position remains that Ukraine is sovereign. We believe it's in our national interest that they be sovereign. In my view, they're the hinge on which the future of Europe really turns. And we also take the position as Americans and all of our allies that Crimea is still a part of Ukraine. Otherwise, if you surrender that, Jim, you're basically giving away the whole game. At that point, you're basically communicating to the Russians and everybody else in the world that aggression and conquest is the new order of the day in the 21st century. I don't think we ought to do that, and I don't think that's in the American national interest.
Are there OSCE monitors in Crimea as well?
No, they're not permitted in Crimea. The Russians occupy that completely. They take the position, they have annexed it. They do not allow OSCE monitors to go into Crimea. But we examine Crimea all the time. The Tartars are the native population of Crimea, and they are either being prosecuted, put in prison, killed in some cases, deported, and many of them have fled to the West. And I had an opportunity while I was in Ukraine to meet with them.
Gotcha. As you know, I was ambassador to Romania under President Clinton, and so issues involving Moldova and Transnistria loom large in Romania. To what extent are the Moldovan and Transnistria issues on the OSCE's agenda these days?
They're very high on the OSCE agenda. The OSCE agenda includes lots of different conflict zones over there right now, which is why I made the comment that I think Europe is very unstable. It is, because Moldova is an area located right there between Romania and Ukraine. It's partially occupied by Russian troops. They don't want them there. They want to get them out of that Transnistria province and get them someplace else. But Moldova does remain sovereign to this day, even if partially occupied. But we also have to remember the Georgia conflict. That's a real war that's really going on right now, or at least it's a Cold War there, with the Russians partially occupying part of Georgia and Russia occupying through proxies at least part of eastern Ukraine. They're threatening the Baltic countries, which are very much a part of OSCE and very strong participants in OSCE, not to mention the other countries that are surrounding Russia, including countries in their former Soviet republics in Central Asia. They also intend to remain sovereign. So there's a lot of conflict going on, but it was a principal focus of OSCE.
But you came back recently from this mission to Ukraine to see what was going on the ground and listen to Ukrainians directly. Why don't you tell us a little bit about that and what you learned?
Well, I was invited to go as former ambassador on behalf of the American Foreign Policy Council. That's a think tank that's located in Washington, D.C. Herman Pershner has been the leader of it for many years, but they have an advisory board. They've just asked me to join. And they invited me to go over and lead a delegation over there. And there was a really good group of people that went, people who had been previously in government, a member of the National Security Council that went over there with us. And it was a great experience. We met with about 14 or 15 cabinet ministers while we were there. We also were taken out down to the southern area and went out onto the Sea of Azov, Jim. I didn't mention that earlier, but the Ukrainian Coast Guard actually put us in a fast boat and took us out onto the Sea of Azov, where we confronted basically a Russian picket ship that was out there run by their FSB. And in addition to that, afterwards, we put on protective gear and went out to the battlefield, which is just east of Mariupol, and overlooked that battlefield and had a chance to see exactly what was going on in some of the ruined areas around that battlefield that's ongoing right now.
On that particular visit, when you say battlefield, what does it look like? What do you see?
It's a wide open area that's under the guns of both sides. There's entrenchments and places where both sides can have people. The Russians have sent in their professional sniper corps. They frequently shoot Ukrainian soldiers if they can get a good look at them, and they use them for practice, basically. It's a pretty tough situation, but I can report to you from my meetings, Jim, that the Ukrainians are determined to remain independent. They see themselves as culturally different from the Russians. They look back to their history more towards Byzantium as opposed to the Russians being elsewhere. They see their language is different, their culture is different, and they're absolutely determined to remain independent. On the other hand, the most recent statements from Vladimir Putin indicates that Putin intends to take them back over again. So this is a conflict that's a very serious problem. And frankly, sooner or later, I think it's going to present the United States with a serious set of decisions.
The Ukrainians you talk to, I mean, they've lived with the Russians for all time. They lived with them before the Soviet Union. They lived with them in the Soviet Union. They lived with them after the Soviet Union. Putin and the Russians have been, in one sense, unpredictable. Let me say unpredictable. You can say, given history, it was all predictable. But in fact, they didn't invade 15 years ago. They did invade 7 or 8 years ago. They haven't invaded more since then. They could invade more in the future. I'm curious from the Ukrainian point of view, how do they evaluate sort of the Russian strategy towards Ukraine?
Well, of course, I only spoke to the people who are part of the government.
Right.
So if there's pro-Russian citizens there, and there are some, or
Right.
leadership, I didn't get to talk to them very much.
Okay.
But the fact is that the Russian government, from stem to stern, up and down the line, all ministries are determined to remain independent. The consistent message to us as delegation was they want to be part of NATO. Putin has been always saying that that's a red line. They don't want NATO to be right there in a former Soviet republic. The fact is this, I want to come directly to the point. If Ukraine remains independent and actually creates a legitimate democracy and one that is not corrupt and one that actually stands for human rights and values, how can that organization, that country exist side by side with Russia and Russia maintain its position as an authoritarian country? I don't believe they can. I don't think Putin thinks they can. And that's why I think he's so determined to suppress Ukraine. They had a big military build up this past spring. There was real concern that they, in fact, might invade. That was about the time of the, in my opinion, ill-advised Biden summit. They then eased down a bit. The Ukrainians believe they will be invaded. Don't know if they will or not. I believe that the American policy ought to be to shore them up as much as possible and to make it as costly as possible if the Russians do invade. But in the meanwhile, Ukraine has their own work to do. They have their own country to build. Their economic efforts are underway. I met with the people from the Bank of Ukraine. We met with economic development, a lot of security people, military, intelligence. It was a very broad trip to Ukraine.
How militarily insecure do they feel in the sense of their own military capacity?
Well, I think they feel inferior to the Russian army. The Russian army, this is a holdover from the old Cold War days. They're still a very large army and very sophisticated in a lot of their technology. Some years ago, when the Russians first invaded and took over the eastern part of the country, it's clear that Ukraine was inadequate to stand up to them. Now I think that by all reports, they're better able to stand up. They may not be able to stop a full-fledged war in the absence of Western support, but I think they can cost the Russians a lot of deaths, a lot of soldiers. And I think that Putin is not so secure in his country right now that he can really afford to have tens of thousands of body bags coming back to Moscow. So that might discourage him from making a mistake. Nonetheless, in my view, the United States needs to exercise good diplomacy here and to make it as difficult as possible for the Russians to break the international law and to break the structure of peace in Europe, make it as hard as possible for them and try to deter them from making a really bad mistake. They could make a mistake and the United States could respond, and then it's game on. I don't think they want that.
Understand. You mentioned them wanting to join NATO. It is not the policy of the United States, wasn't under President Trump, is not under President Biden for the United States to support inviting Ukraine into NATO. Two questions. One is, to what extent are there European countries that are in OSCE who you worked with, who now would support bringing Ukraine into NATO? Are there any?
It is not my impression that the countries that are in OSCE would choose to support NATO membership for Ukraine at this time, and nor do I. I think that it's too soon. I think that time has to go by. I think Ukraine has to build up their institutions a lot more strongly. They have to build up their own ability to protect themselves, which they're, by the way, busily at work doing. And I think that right now it would be smarter to wait for a more civilized Russia to emerge, one that's more willing to get along with its neighbors, even its Slavic neighbors. And then at that point, there might be a better environment for some type of quasi-military relationship. But I think that it's premature right now. That's not what the Ukrainians would want to hear me say, but I'm being candid with my friends.
No, I understand. Well, then the second question is, how much do the Ukrainians you met with, the leaders of the government, think getting into NATO in the foreseeable future is realistic? I mean, they want to do it, but do they have a sense that it's not really realistic at this point?
Well, who knows what they really think? They were talking to me diplomatically and semi-officially. They knew I wasn't any longer an ambassador, but they know I get around in American politics, so they were, pretty serious about telling me their official position, and they never deviated, Jim. Never. Every meeting, no matter how high up in the government people were, or how further down the food chain, everybody was relentless about their desire to join NATO. I think that it creates a confrontation. It's very risky. Who knows what will happen? If Putin makes a mistake that costs his own country badly, which may cost him his own government, which may ruin Russia, really, if he does all that kind of thing, the U.S. is going to be confronted with a very serious decision, not to mention the French, the Germans, and the British. And I must say, I think our British allies have really been stepping up to the plate lately, I must say.
Interesting. Well, let's now switch over more to Russia in terms of you're working with them in OSCE, thinking about them in the context of Ukraine and thinking about where they're going, what they're up to. I mean, I think it's pretty conventional wisdom that that Putin isn't a happy man, and that he's trying to become a happier man by being a bigger guy on the world stage. But beyond that, what is your sense from being up close and personal with the Russian diplomats and then following this very closely as to what's really going on in Putin and the Russian strategy these days?
Well, just like I was a spokesman for American policy, which I helped shape, I think, and worked very closely with the State Department and with the White House to issue our statements. Likewise, we operate certainly under the belief that everything that the Russian diplomats said at Vienna at OSCE was official. Even the nuance, we listened closely to each other as to what our respective governments were saying and the way that we were saying it. To come directly to the point, I actually liked the Russian ambassador. I actually liked him a lot. And I liked the people who were his staff people as well, his deputy ambassadors and his chargés and people. I actually liked them very much. But that's because I respected them. I understood that they were doing what they needed to do to represent their country and to do so effectively. But they were quite clear that they wanted to stand up for Russia and to have Russia be a full participant. You know, OSCE is a consensus organization. One country saying no vetoes things in the OSCE. I used to think that was a problem. As I grew more mature in the job, I came to understand that it really wasn't a problem at all, that the purpose of the organization is not to win a vote, is to interact diplomatically and to understand where everybody is. And frankly, sometimes to learn what people are thinking and then to transmit that back to Washington.
That's very interesting, actually. So are there any examples of what you learned from the Russians in particular about their posture, their interests that was helpful, do you think, to the United States?
Well, I think that what I learned was what their goal and mission is. In writ large, they would like to reassemble the Soviet Union. I think they cannot do that, but they would like to. And at the very least, they would like to put back within their at least sphere of influence, if not their country proper, the former Soviet socialist republics. They would like to do that. I'm not sure they can do that either, as a matter of fact. I mean, Georgia and Ukraine are absolutely certain that they don't want to be any part of anything like that Russian empire anymore. They're very determined about it. Also, I think that we need to know, I asked me a question, I'll give you the answer. The answer is you learn a lot by listening to what the Russians say and what the Russians do. When the time came to interact with all the internal politics of OSCE, you watched to see what alliances were being created. You watched to see whether their former countries worked with them or not, or where the limitations of that was, where they felt they could work with Russia in order to deal with a country right adjacent to them, but there were limitations if it went too far on their sovereignty. So you learned a great deal about the way the Russians were trying to carry out their mission. The most important message that I would give your listeners is I spent a lot of time thinking about the Eastern European countries and working with the European countries, Eastern European countries. First ambassador that came to see me when I went to Vienna was the ambassador from Romania. I was very close to the ambassador from Hungary. I understand Hungary's point of view in a way that I think the modern media in America doesn't understand. Poland the same way. There are headlines today that are very anti-Poland. I think I understand where these countries are. And quite simply, they basically told me on multiple occasions, you know, we just got rid of the Russians a few years ago. Why would we now want to go back into a bureaucratic organization like the European Union and give up all of our sovereignty? I had a tough time as an American arguing with that point, to tell you the truth.
Did you find Poland and Hungary a good example? I mean, sometimes for reasons of their domestic politics, they are characterized as being more friendly to Russia than Americans would expect. Did you see that in the OSCE?
No, it is the reverse. They are not friendly to Russia. They are determined to be independent of Russia. They understand that Russia is pushing on them and they don't like it. And they are, as long as the Western powers led by the United States have their backs, they're going to be fine. And they're going to be a part of the European construct, not necessarily the European Union, but they're going to be part of the structure of peace and security and interaction and economics within the European structure. And beyond, by the way, as I've said, the OSCE is very much larger than just Central Europe. But I was working all the time with Central Europe. By the way, I will tell you all that going to Vienna is really a plum assignment. That is a beautiful place to be, a lovely city. Interestingly enough, When I arrived in Vienna, I thought that Vienna was going to be sort of like, Rome, Berlin, Paris, London, and all that. It's really not like that at all. It's really the northernmost city of the Balkans.
Right.
And it looks more east than it does west. Very interesting, isn't it? They're much more interested in what's going on in places like Prague and in the Slovak Republic, in the Balkans. I worked and interacted very closely with the Albanians, who was the chairman of the organization for a large time that I was there. It's an interesting city, a beautiful city. Anybody that goes there is lucky.
No, you're exactly right. And your point about the relationship to Central Europe and to Southeast Europe is exactly right. And obviously it comes from the Austro-Hungarian Empire.
Just so.
They've been around that area a lot. And one of the things that I saw when I was ambassador to Romania is in diplomacy and in business, the Austrians were so much more sophisticated about Southeast Europe than many of the Western Europeans for that reason, because they've been around the neighborhood a long time.
You bet. And when you walk around the streets of Vienna, you see everybody there from Eastern Europe that are coming in to visit. That's where they can get to, and they're really having a good time in a place like Vienna. It's a beautiful city. It's a high diplomacy city. And I must sadly enough report the more recent news articles that also point out that in recent days, there have been serious attacks of this Havana syndrome on diplomats and intelligence people in Vienna. Interestingly enough, those attacks began right after I left. I was, of course, as you know, as a Republican, brought home the day that President Biden was inaugurated. After that, there have begun to be, according to the reports, about 24 attacks on and true injuries on diplomats and intelligence people in Vienna.
Oh, that's so sad to hear. Just to wrap up on Russia, again, from your exposure and knowledge, do you think that Russia today, in terms of their agenda, which you very eloquently described, do you think they are optimistic that they can accomplish their agenda, or are they depressed that they're not able to accomplish their agenda?
Ambassador, one could spend a lifetime trying to understand the Russian government and the Russian people. I say this with genuine respect for the Russian people and for the Russian government. I genuinely feel a sense of respect for them. I don't exactly know what they're trying to do. I remember I met with my Russian counterpart, and I've told you I really liked him. And we sat very officially in a room in the Hofburg Palace and talked over our various differences and tried to conduct some diplomacy. And at one point I said to the Russian ambassador, I said, Alexander, I said, we really don't know what you all are trying to do, And his eyes got real big, like Americans don't know everything. But, I told him, we don't completely know what you're trying to accomplish here. But if you do the wrong thing, you can make a serious mistake that can lead to a problem. And I am very worried about it. I've told you, Jim, I think that Europe is unstable. I think the Russians are making it unstable deliberately. There is a possibility of a real general war in Europe. We don't think about that when we go to Europe and we look at the Eiffel Tower and the Tower of London and all this kind of nice stuff. But from my perch at OSCE in Vienna, Austria, it is a dangerous continent. I don't exaggerate. The Russians are occupying these countries. There's a shooting going on. There was a real war between Armenia and Azerbaijan and the Turks. There's real stuff going on over there that makes the continent quite unstable, and I'm very worried about it. So my hope is that as time goes on, the Russians will drop back and actually try to build their country instead of this sort of sense that they can't really be great unless they conquer other people or get influence over other people, because they're going to have a lot of pushback on that, and hopefully including from the United States.
Ambassador, thank you very, very much. Very interesting insights on things that are very important to the United States.
Thank you for the chance to do the podcast with you, Ambassador.
This has been the American Ambassadors Live podcast. To hear more from us, subscribe to the American Ambassadors Live podcast and leave us a review. Tweet us your thoughts on this week's episode and tag us at AMER Ambassadors using the hashtag AmbassadorsLive.